Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Carmony, and I'm your host for today. My guest today is Paddy Connolly. Paddy is a global responsible AI and generative AI research manager based in Dublin, Ireland. He's also a fellow with the World Economic Forum. An electronic engineer by training, Paddy has built his research career on inter alia implementing responsible AI, conversational AI ethics, generative AI implementation, algorithmic fairness, and responsible AI maturity frameworks. Paddy has authored and co-authored multiple studies on responsible AI, including work published in MIT Sloan Management Review. His most recent research contribution includes Responsible AI in the Global Context, Maturity Model and Survey, which surveyed 1,000 organizations across 20 industries and 19 geographical regions on responsible AI maturity. Paddy is joining us today in his personal capacity. The views he shares on this podcast today are his own. Welcome, Paddy.
Thank you, Kamini. Thank you for having me. It's a real privilege to be here. Really looking forward to getting into the conversation. We had a quick chat there before we started, and I think we're coming at this from a very similar perspective around justice, given your background. And also, I want to give a shout out. I noticed yesterday that you have a book online. It's just $5. I think absolutely, I'm going to download it and have a look. So, congratulations on your publication.
Thank you very, very much. I appreciate that. Uh, Paddy, when we connected, you made this distinction that caught my attention. I sent you two potential topics. One was on operationalizing responsible AI frameworks, and the other one was building trust in AI systems. You called it the first RAA 1.0 and the second RAA 2.0. So this suggests a fundamental evolution in how we think about responsible AI. So can you explain what the difference is between RAA 1.0 and RAA 2.0? Thank you.
Yeah, Kamini, it's a concept I've been thinking about for the last couple of years, and responsible AI is always evolving, right? Along with AI, it has to evolve. That's the nature of it. But I think Gen AI has been a trigger point for this concept of responsible AI 2.0, and then AI agents is kind of really where we're going to see that necessity for change. And if we look at kind of responsible AI today, which we're already starting to call traditional AI, but in reality, it's today's AI. It's still very much standard practice, right? It's been built up really over the last 10 years, and it's based on companies developing their own models from scratch. We're kind of largely dealing with a static model where that does one thing, doesn't generally change an awful lot. The risks are kind of largely understood. And so generally, a lot of the mitigation tends to happen pre-deployment. And so before you go live, you've identified your risks, you've put in place mitigation strategies, and you're kind of good to go. Obviously, there's a bit of ongoing monitoring and control required, but our research kind of suggests that's the bit that companies are probably weakest at, and it tends to be a bit passive, right? Because usually you kind of set a metric, set a threshold on it, and you respond as and when that threshold is breached. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is perfectly efficient approach to responsible AI today, and it will be the basis of responsible AI 2.0. So you need to really put in place these organizational structures and mitigation strategies today to do AI. But as we move to agentic AI, I think it's a very different beast, right? And even Gen AI, it's non-deterministic. It's generalized for multiple tasks. It's very dynamic nature. Particularly agents, and even model development. Right today, I know this will change as we get smaller Gen AI models, but today it's largely controlled by a small handful of companies. So suddenly everyone's a buyer rather than a developer. And so I think there's a major shift that happens now that we're seeing already, where risk is kind of a dynamic problem that occurs in post-production, right? That happens in real time. It changes and it evolves. Agents are able to take actions independently. They can access tools, they can access files, they can communicate with other agents to make decisions, etc. And we can kind of set controls and guardrails around those, but over time, in the wrong context, the behaviors of agents change and evolve dynamically, kind of in ways that are hard to predict, and we're never really programmed in the first place. And if you've got a thousand agents working across your organization and interacting externally with clients, partners, competitors, this is kind of monitoring and control at a completely different scale. And so, the question is, how do you trust an agent that's built on a non-deterministic LLM to persistently do what it is supposed to do? And kind of the answer is you can't, right? Fundamentally today you can't. And so but also you can't rely on the past approach to this, really the current approach to this. And now we've got to kind of go out and build the infrastructure that allows you to kind of make sure the agent is doing what it's supposed to be doing, which in turn B will enable you to communicate to others that agent is consistently doing what it's supposed to, and so can be trusted. So I think a lot of this is around. I mean, trust has always been important, right? But I think it's kind of really important now that agents will be kind of so dynamic and have so much autonomy, in theory, anyway. And so I think what we have to now do to support that kind of idea of persistent trust, we can't rely on pre-deployment mitigation or kind of governance documents. We have to build out infrastructure. So we're moving from kind of static models with known risks to system-centric infrastructure. And so we're going to need a governance layer that's much more dynamic. And I kind of think about this in a corporate environment. We can largely trust our employees to kind of follow the rules, respect policies, et cetera, right? And they also understand the consequences of not doing that. With agents, there's none of that, right? You literally have to code corporate governance for them and create the necessary boundaries and infrastructures to ensure they don't stray. We're obviously going to need a security layer. I think anyone I know from security space is scared stiff of agents in any number of ways. I don't think we're only, we've heard of kind of cases of companies, secretaries transferring $20 million because they've been spoofed, etc. But I think we're really only kind of at the tip of the iceberg there on that one. We're going to need secure communication layers. I think we're starting to see standards, or not standards, but more protocols emerge around that. But we're also kind of getting down into the nitty gritty of it. We're going to literally have to track every decision and every action that's taken by these agents, so that we can identify risks before they become problems. We can respond to major errors in real time, and then we can kind of dynamically update our governance, our rules and regulations, our guardrails, so that it doesn't happen again. We're going to need kind of traceability, accountability, explainability, infrastructure. Saying that it wasn't me, it was the agent won't cut it. We're going to need to be able to understand why it did what it did and how we can change that, and who was responsible for it. And so I think what we're going to see is that we're going to need to create new trust mechanisms, new ways of demonstrating to the enterprise themselves and to their partners and their customers and their competitors that their agents are trustworthy, are managing the risks, and therefore you can interact with them safely.
Thanks for that, Paddy. I mean, you've raised a lot of issues here that I'd like to drill down into. So, firstly, just basic, simple explanation for our listeners and for myself. What is the difference between Gen AI and agentic AI?
It's a good question. So I think really it's a number of things. One is, ultimately agents are built today on LLMs. But I think it's the ability. It's really you're taking a systems approach now. So now you're looking at the agent, but within a particular environment, usually an enterprise environment, and its ability, not only to kind of reason and take action, but to use tools to access memory, to interact with other agents or other people, other software packages. And so I think it's that ability to do that autonomously or largely autonomously That's where the big shift is.
You spoke about the questions of the issues of consistency and transparency in relation to autonomy. How do you reconcile the terms of consistency, transparency, where there is autonomy and also black box systems that impacts on explainability?
Yeah, it's a slightly different way of thinking about it, Kevin. I think we're used to thinking about this, looking at the model and how did the model arrive at a decision, right? And so I think it goes back to that point of we're moving from a static model-centric approach to a systems approach. So now we have this agent that's acting within a system or an environment. And we're not less, I mean, we can look at, how it arrived at its decision. LLMs are capable of that, although they are, with the caveats that apply in terms of their ability to make things up and then tell you, make up a reason for why they made the decision. But actually, what we're looking at in this context is, we'll set controls on agents in terms of what they can and can't do, right? What they can and can't access, when they should escalate for particular decisions. And what we're actually looking at here in terms of explainability and transparency is being able to see every one of those and being able to understand if they did the thing that they were supposed to do or not. And then if not, why not? And how do we change it to fix it? So it's trust and transparency and explainability at a system level. And I think it's quite an obvious thing when you think about it, but it's a big shift in how we think about it, if that makes sense.
I'm trying to get my head around it. It does make sense from a systems perspective, but the issue is in terms of our current frameworks, we think about trust in a certain context, trust in terms of explainability at an agent level, at a static model level. So how do we change our shift our thinking from that? Because in terms of the systems that we are, at the rate at which AI is iterating, our static models, our thinking, it's not fit for purpose anymore. Would you think that's an accurate way of looking at it?
Yeah, it's I think it's an expansion. So I think the way we think about RAI today is still is the foundation that you build off. If you don't have the right organizational structures in place, if you don't have the right controls, if you don't understand how to manage a model, you're going to find it very hard to manage an agent in a system, right? And ultimately, again, going back to that point, an agent is built on an LLM today. I mean, that might change and evolve obviously over time. So it's not that I think we have to completely change how we think. I think we have to expand how we think and what we mean by traceability and explainability. Before, like even traceability, right? Traceability is a concept of, as you were building the model, what were the decisions you took? What was the testing and evaluation you did, et cetera, et cetera. Traceability in this context is post-deployment. It's what did the agent do? What did it access? What was this? What actions did it take? So both apply in this context, right? You still want to understand how the model was built and what decisions were made and who made them, but you also want to understand what's happening in real time in terms of the agent. So to me, it's really an expansion of how we think about this. It's kind of meeting the increasing complexity of, generative AI and agentic AI versus traditional AI.
I think I understand where you're coming from because, from a risk management perspective, I've been a risk manager for many, many years. And my argument is our old ways of looking at risk management have become largely obsolete because if you are operating in an environment or an ecosystem of increasing complexity, polycrisis, environment where you have VUCA, Barney, and all of that coming into your ecosystem, that narrow approach doesn't work anymore. We have to apply systems thinking, or we can't adequately manage our risks. So perhaps it's a similar method of thinking about Gen AI and agentic agents.
Yeah, I think it goes back exactly, Kamini, right? I think it goes back to that point of where it is literally just risk management at the end of the day, right? And so the risk has shifted. The risk was pre-deployment, and now it's very much dynamic and post-deployment. And so even just the dynamic nature of it, the fact that it's very changeable, and agents will, the underlying LLMs will be updated, will have new capabilities. What works in one environment may not work in a completely different environment, and so we have to meet the risk where it is. And I think, it's now a much more complex and dynamic risk, and so that means we now need to build off what we have and start thinking more broadly. And to your point, I think systems thinking is a really important approach here.
Patty, I just want to connect this to something that's just happened in South Africa. We have a corporate governance code called King, and it's our framework for how companies should govern themselves responsibly. So King 5 was just launched at the end of October, and it explicitly requires board to govern AI with specific emphasis on establishing accountability for AI-related decisions, actions, and outcome at board level. So what we're moving from is having AI being a nice to have to board level governance requirements. So from your perspective, what would you tell boards to start off with? Where is the starting position here in terms of getting to that accountability for AI related decisions, actions, and outcomes?
Yeah, I haven't seen the document, but I like the direction of it, because okay, we're talking about RAI 2.0, but the reality is most companies are only scratching the surface on agentic, right? We're still very much in the world of 1.0 today. And the research I've done with Stanford on kind of RAI maturity, most companies are still at very early stages of this. It's a slow process, but I think if you look at a lot of the kind of recommendations, guidelines that are out there, they tend to focus on this from a risk management perspective, which makes a lot of sense, right? It's, moving along the AI life cycle from development to deployment. There's not as much focus on that, what I would call organizational infrastructure at the board level and at the C-suite level. It's kind of assumed that companies would be able to do it, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think they can do it to a point, but I think there needs to be more support. I think Singapore have actually done a really good job of that. They actually started with kind of governance before they went into kind of full risk management. And so, like in our experience, or my experience, if you don't have support from the CEO and the board, this doesn't go well. It has to be top down, and you need to have the right governance structures in place. You need the right boards and committees, the right levels of ownership and responsibility. I think there's a habit traditionally of responsible AI coming bottoms up out of the data scientist team, and responsibility kind of being a +1 for the chief AI officer, the chief data officer, or maybe it's more of a legal side. This is a multifunctional problem and will increasingly become so as AI becomes core to most companies' kind of day-to-day operations. It's a legal problem, it's a technical problem, it's a HR problem. There needs to be the establishment of the right people in the right rooms to govern this. And I think boards, C-suite, and it applies to C-suite as well. I think there's probably expertise and literacy issues there that need to be resolved. It's a problem in general. I don't think there's a lot of, I don't think there's a lot of expertise out there, readily available expertise. And so I think companies have to take it upon themselves to build that up.
Going back a little bit, you have a background in electronic engineering and have spent your career in research. So how did you end up working on responsible AI, and what drew you to this field? And also, I'd really like to dive into what you think responsible AI looks like.
Yeah, so it's been a kind of meandering path. I came out of an electronic engineering degree just as the kind of the internet bubble was bursting. So there wasn't a lot of jobs around, and I kind of fell into research, but I loved it. And I found myself kind of falling into consumer AI as it was starting to emerge. I think really it was kind of speculative advanced analytics at the time, right? And so in the form of location-based services, so integration of GPS into consumer devices was happening. Location data was getting very far more granular. Uber wasn't a thing, but there'd already been a number of startups that had tried and failed to do this. I even kind of briefly crossed paths with Sam Altman.
Oh, okay.
Nearly actually. Sorry, I should. I was supposed to be speaking with him on his first startup, but he actually, about a week before we were due to speak, he sold his location-based services company to one of the big carriers. So never had that call. Who knows how things might have played out if we had spoken. But I think the thing that struck me was you could see kind of where this was going, right, in terms of kind of ethics, privacy, manipulation, targeting. I mean, granular location is a very powerful thing in the wrong hands. In the right hands, it's also amazing, right? My daughter, I have I never thought I would say this, but I have one of those kind of GPS watches, which just gives her so much more freedom. We live in a big city, and so I can allow her to get out there and explore and take a few risks, and still have the peace of mind. So, it's an amazing thing, but it can also, you can see the risks that could come out, that could emerge. And so, as I kind of started to focus on AI, it was around the time that AI really kind of had its first wave in terms of in the kind of modern sense, and so we started to see AI adopted in a lot of public service areas and so on. I think there was a lot of funding available in the US, for example. And it kind of hard to think of it like this, but when AI came out first, this was going to be the objective truth teller that was going to save us from all those human biases, all those cases of racist judges and racist policemen and what have you. And so that was the big selling point, right? We were finally going to rid ourselves of this. But as it started to happen, we started to see the harms emerge. Particularly, I think, the sense of injustice, particularly in terms of the people who carry the burden, tended to be vulnerable communities, ethnic minorities, people of kind of low, weak economic backgrounds. And so I think you see this today, even talking to you before we started the podcast. The people who were in this space and got into this space at the start, it was very much driven by a sense of justice. And so, I think I was lucky enough, in the research group team that I work in, if there's demand, you can do what you want. And so focusing on this area, got an opportunity to work on one of the first kind of algorithmic fairness tools and kind of all went from there.
Can you tell me about that, your work on algorithmic fairness? What were you trying to solve, and what did you learn from the early work that still shapes how you think about AI ethics today? Just going back to your point about, we thought about AI being this paragon of virtue because it's going to be so ethical, but we forgot to think we're going to train it on data that is human. And we are very much biased, and we are not very nice people most of the time. So, yeah. We shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I mean, I think the whole idea of bias, we understand it so much better now. And at the time, we were really just kind of exploring it. We kind of knew there was problems, but we didn't know there were so many types of bias, right? And as I'll talk to in a minute, also there are lots of different types of fairness, right? Which is also a kind of a problem. But yeah, I kind of had the luck of working with, I don't know, do you know Ruman Chowdhury? She is, if there's godfathers in AI, responsible AI is full of godmothers, and she is very much one of the godmothers, and she would lead this project, and I mean, talk about a presence, like talk about someone you follow into battle. So she really drove this effort, learned huge amount from her, huge, because she was at this intersection of technology. She had a technical background, but she had a kind of a behavioral and societal background, and I learned that lesson very early. And I think we're all still learning that, right? That we tend to treat this as a technical problem with technical solutions, but ultimately it's a societal problem, right? And we need more societal solutions here. But anyway, I'm meandering a little bit. So this opportunity came up. We started to become aware of, and to the point I just made, right? we became aware of these problems of bias. We started to understand, a lot of this was coming in from the data. We were training models on historical data. If that data is based off, historically biased decisions, you're going to get bias. It's actually going to perpetuate that problem, right? Again, kind of well documented territory at this stage. But we needed tools to understand where the problems were surfacing or where they were originating, what was the root cause, and then also, we started to again look at this technical problem, looking for technical solutions. So we started to define these definitions of fairness and how could we maybe apply these. And so we worked on this. A number of other companies and a lot of academic people worked on this. Much like RAI still today, academia drives this. They are at the bleeding edge. Thankfully, they continue to do so. And if I'm totally honest, right, I I don't know a lot about. I'm not. I've lost a lot of my technical edge over the years. So things like confusion matrices, they're very much appropriately named for the likes of me. But it was my first experience as well of a multidisciplinary team. We had data scientists, we had engineers, we had designers, we had behavioral scientists, we had researchers, and it was just an amazing experience. And we were still just figuring it out as we went, but trying to do good work. And so I think in terms of the good and the bad or the lessons that we learned, I think these tools really helped to move the conversation forward. It really helped to show companies where there were problems in their data, or there's lots of different biases. There's historical bias, sample bias, aggregation bias. There's a big long list of them, right? And we know that now because of building these types of tools. But also from from a solution perspective, we started to see how might we adjust models, adjust data, adjust outputs to align with definitions of fairness. But as I said, I think it's still a really difficult problem to solve because around the time we were building that, actually Arvind Narayanan from Princeton had a paper, or he gave a presentation on, I think it was 23 definitions of fairness. So all these and also how they kind of contradict each other, right? So you could have one definition, but that works for a certain classification of people, but doesn't work in another context. And so it's still a problem that's ongoing. Fairness is a cultural thing. What's considered fair in one culture is very different than another. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done there, but it was a real baptism of fire. I got to work with some amazing people, and it all went from there.
You talked about working in a cross-functional team, a mixed team, and that issue is coming up more and more. We used to like saying diversity in the past. Diversity is good. Diversity brings these perspectives. But more and more, I'm seeing this in the context of development teams. We're talking about mixed teams, skills, cross-functionality. And I think to myself, is this their way of saying we absolutely need a mixed team because that is one of the tools we use against bias? Would that be a stretch?
Yeah, it's there's three. I'm gonna kind of forget one of these, I think, but there's multifunctional at the governance. There's multi-discipline at the kind of building level, and there is multi-stakeholder at the kind of the involvement and the problem level. The three multis, and they're all very critical. The multifunction is critical at the company level, as we discussed. I think in terms of understanding problems, the multi-stakeholder involvement is vital. And I think we've made some progress in that, in terms of we talk about co-creation, bringing the users in to test and validate as part of the user testing. But that kind of is really that's really solving design problems and usability problems. What I think we need to do, where AI has worked really well, particularly in public services or areas where large swathes of the population will be affected, is bringing the stakeholders, all stakeholders in throughout the whole process. So bringing them in at the start, building buy-in and trust, having them involved throughout the development process, because there are local problems and local issues that that need to be accounted for. But then also, having them involved in kind of the outputs and the outcomes, and having ownership and a say in that. When it comes to multidiscipline, I think that then is how you solve for all those problems, right? As I said earlier, we tend to think of this as a technical problem with technical solutions. That's really not the case. Like, quite an awful lot of the problems that I see that are kind of pinned on AI, or the model, quite often are design problems. It hasn't been designed well, and so the users don't use it in the right way, or it's misused, or it's manipulative in how it's implemented. So, and also the other side that I think is really important is the behavioral side. So particularly as it becomes more of an enterprise tool, this idea of trust. There's trust at the individual level as well, right? And do they have the right level of trust? We always think of trust as this idea of the more trust, the better, right? But when it comes to people who are actually using it, what we need is trust calibration. They need to trust it when they should trust it, and not trust it when they shouldn't. And so that can lead to a lot of problems as well. And so there, things like behavioral science are critical. But on the flip side of this, right, a lot of companies, smaller companies especially, won't have the resources for this kind of thing. So it's all about, you have to cut your cloth accordingly. But I think definitely there's a clear path towards multidisciplinary development and design of AI.
Paddy, let's talk about the paper that was presented on responsible AI in the global context, maturity model and survey. And the idea there was that, what came out of that is that we should focus on trust becoming strategic. So you position trust as moving beyond governance to something more fundamental. So when organizations come to you to say that they want to build trust in AI, what are they talking about? What actually needs to be done? What are they asking for?
Yeah, trust. It's so this is a hard question to answer succinctly. I think ultimately, it depends on who needs the trust and what do they need it for, right? There are, is it a regulator? Is it a consumer? Is it an employee? If you go right down to the fundamentals of trust, there's kind of 4 pillars of trust, which are competence, reliability, integrity, and empathy, which essentially are kind of cognitive trust and emotional trust. And then also, if you go another layer down, you kind of start to, it's trust in what, right? I have a friend who I would trust with my daughter in any situation. But I wouldn't trust them to be early to meet. They've never been early in their life, right? So it's trust in what? So I think when it's companies, fundamentally, we've gone through kind of waves of what trust is. It started with accuracy, then reliability, then we started getting into fairness and explainability. We're now very much, I think, in a kind of a compliance era. And now I think as we move to Gen AI and agentic AI, trust will very much become about, unlocking value, and also, trust at the enterprise level themselves, right? So we often think about this in the context of a regulator or a consumer, but agents and LLMs are fundamentally non-deterministic. And so can the enterprise trust them themselves? And this is actually one of the biggest barriers to Gen AI adoption today, is that they just can't get their arms around the risks enough to scale. So trust means a lot of different things to a lot of people. I think companies today are doing all the right things. They are primarily focused on kind of being able to demonstrate compliance. They are, they are starting to build out their RAI frameworks. And then that gives you kind of the ability to address the different stakeholders and their different kind of trust needs. So an employee, what they need is going to be quite different from a regulator. But what's really important is having that underlying structure that you can build from.
Okay, I'm feeling a bit jaded now. From what I'm hearing you saying is that trust should be fit for purpose in terms of context-specific risk management. Tell me I'm jaded, or is this correct?
It's tricky, right? Because I know we've been saying this for a long time, and so but adoption still remains very low. So I mean, sometimes I publish a lot of papers and articles and stuff, and people will be pitching ideas to me or whatever. We said that 5 years ago, and so it's still the same principle. It's still the same solution in some ways at an enterprise level, right? I think it does change, as we discussed at the top of the conversation, when we move to agentic AI. What matters now is the agent, and can it demonstrate? So can with traditional static models, you demonstrate trust before you go into deployment, right? This thing is accurate. This thing is reliable. We did all the tests and evaluations. With agents, it's now very much dynamic. It's real time. It's persistent. So trust becomes very much a deployment problem to solve, and for different reasons. I think this is very much about unlocking value, which is a very different way. RAI has always been kind of pigeonholed as a compliance issue, and it is to some degrees. But our work, some of the research we've done, demonstrates the inherent value of responsible AI. I think now with Gen AI and agentic, trust and responsible AI you just can't scale. You can't unlock the value, so it becomes a value lever, really. So I think that, to me, we're quite jaded in that we've been saying this for 10 years, but I think the shift to compliance and now value is where we're going to see mass adoption.
Okay, back to the study, responsible AI in the global context. In your experience, what separates organizations that genuinely operationalize responsible AI for those that are going through the motions? You mentioned things like unlocking value. You mentioned things like, this moving from compliance to another phase. So, what patterns are emerging from the global data?
Yeah, it's the reality, right, is there aren't there aren't a lot of companies who are doing this very well. I think it's kind of less than 1%, in terms of what the kind of the barrier, the benchmark that we set. So this is based off work that we did with Stanford. We kind of saw Gen AI coming, and we said, okay, well, what does responsible AI look like in a Gen AI world, right? Because now you do have things like environmental issues are important, when maybe they less so maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So how do we think about it in that context? Security is now a big issue in AI, where it kind of wasn't 3 or 4 years ago. And so, but to answer your question, I think it's so what you've got. We separate it out into organizational and operational maturity. So organizational maturity is, do you have the right governance structures in place? Have you got a risk management framework fully operationalized? Do you have monitoring and control? And so I think a lot of companies today are doing this to some degree. The robustness of that kind of is hard to determine. And so I think they're doing a lot of the organizational stuff, which is brilliant. That's the foundation. But the gap then really emerges at the operational side, which is really, very simply, are you putting in place all the mitigation techniques that you need to make sure that you have managed this risk, you've locked it down? And what we're seeing is they're doing bits and pieces, but they're not doing all of the mitigation techniques, and they're not doing them systematically across the organization. And that's really where the gap is. But I think that gap speaks to an earlier problem in terms of how robust is that organizational maturity that they put in place. Do they really believe this? Is it back from the CEO down, and everything?
So moving from that on to frameworks that do travel. Working globally, how do responsible AI frameworks travel across different regulatory environments and organization cultures? What works in one context but fails in another, in your opinion?
Yeah, it kind of goes to a point we made earlier, which is, I think there is global consistency in terms of, at a high level, for today's AI. What are the risks? How do we create the infrastructure within organizations at a high level, to mitigate those risks in a way that's trustworthy, and what we mean by trustworthiness. I think there's obviously flexibility in that last piece. So I think at a high level, I did some work with WEF last year, and we looked at this by, in different countries and regions, and also in different kind of industries. And if you look at the frameworks that are being kind of recommended or acting as guidelines, there's strong consistency across, across all these different areas. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with that as a starting point, but I think you have to then factor in the local knowledge, local kind of context as to how you identify specifically what those. So for example, data is a risk category, right? That every company struggles with, or every country maybe struggles with. But what does that actually mean in South Africa versus Ireland? They're quite different. They could potentially be quite different problems, and so how you actually mitigate those problems could be quite different. So that then is where I think the variation starts to happen.
Yeah. One issue moving along, the conversational AI and human-like systems. I wanted to talk to you about this, but I see we're running out of time. But let's just touch on this quickly. Your work on conversational AI ethics deals with systems that increasingly mimic human relationships and interactions. Does that change how we think about organizational trust in AI? What's different when AI becomes more human-like? There's been so many studies coming out recently talking about psychosis, human beings dealing with, getting, being prone to suicidal ideations, and all of that thing. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, it's an area I've been looking at for a while, and I think it started with kind of anthropomorphization of AI when we saw it with chatbots, and obviously now with Gen AI and agents, the potential for human-like interactions and experiences, goes through the roof, right? But it's a problem that's been around for a long time. It's it's something that we inherently do. It's, if you're familiar with the Henry Hoover that has a little face on it, we have this inherent kind of bias towards, humanizing inanimate objects.
I work. Boaty McBoat face.
Exactly. I actually worked with a lady, amazing lady who researched the use of bomb disposal robots in the military, and the people that operated those robots, when invariably they would get damaged in disposing bombs. And I mean, these people, it was as if someone had died. There was PTSD. There was, so there's this inherent kind of it's built into us to do these things, and so then that creates the opportunity for manipulation, right? And so as the capabilities grow, the ability to, it's a great expression, the ability to simulate and stimulate human emotion becomes much stronger. And so I think that, again, that creates huge opportunities. Like, for example, I've started using an AI therapist app, partly to really dig into this and try and understand. We've heard all these stories, incredibly sad, and it is a huge concern. And I wanted to kind of get in there, get my hands on there, see what it's like, and I can really see the benefits of these things. I mean, if I have a problem at work or I've done something at home, it's kind of, okay, how do I deal with this? How do I not do this again the next time? And having this thing on call all day, every day, absolutely amazing. But I also see the dangers of it. I'm coming into this with my eyes wide open, and I think a lot of other people aren't. So the issue here then really is, are you using these capabilities to create huge opportunities to do great things? They also create huge opportunities for manipulation, particularly of vulnerable communities. So going back to trust, competence, reliability, integrity, empathy, it's that emotional side. What's your intent here? Do you have the best intentions for the users of this or not? And so I think there's a real need to look at this and try to at least identify principles that companies can work to understand the implications of what they're doing, and how they can kind of affect their users either intentionally or not. And so I think there's a big gap. It applies to design more generally in terms of AI design. I think there's a need. I wrote a chapter in the recent WEF report on this need to really look at that design side of it's kind of an underrated space in terms of where harms can emerge, but also where harms can be mitigated. And I think a big part of this is about understanding of what's capable here. And so I think that's going to be I think it's clearly already a major issue. And I think if we can kind of start to really think through this problem, we can create kind of guardrails and guidance for companies to try and prevent kind of unintended harms occurring. Like, I don't think anybody wants what's been happening in terms of some of the stories we've heard over the last 12 months. And so how can we prevent that from happening again?
So, Paddy, that's interesting that you say that we anthropomorphize AI, because one of the things I'm finding is that with this emerging technology is this emerging risks, but also in terms of how we view our ethical frameworks. And I'll tell you why, because the other day, I was on LinkedIn, and some person with a PhD was writing about, PhDs are not for people who are not brave. And there was a video there about this pig was eating chilies, and this dog came in and pushed the pig and started eating the chilies. And it was very graphic. The dog was suffering. And a lot of people laughed about that, it's like funny. So I went in there and I was like, so maybe rightly or wrongly, I don't know, but that's the way I feel. I said, these things have been coming out a lot on Facebook, these AI gen videos and things like that. And especially these ones where you see animals or babies or whatever being harmed in some way or the other. And it upset me,
Yeah.
and I was trying to examine why it upset me. And I thought to myself, I should be upset, because the fact is, what is the difference between synthetic and real content that shows pain and suffering? And then I realized a lot of people the reason why they laughed perhaps was because they thought they were being silly by being offended by synthetic content, which is not, it's not correct. If you are offended by it, you are seeing something, whether synthetic or not, being injured or being hurt. It's like, and then I wrote an article after that, and I said, I mean, who among us hasn't cried the Lion King's father died? For me, my personal, I'm a bit older than that. When I saw that whole Dumbo movie, and he goes and he sees his mother, being imprisoned, and I was howling after that, because it touched me. So what? We are human, we are rational, and that's the way we should take it. Not that AI, we should interact. Build in the biases. Human beings are built in a certain way. This is how we react to it. And it's not our fault, and it shouldn't be made our fault, but we should design our technology around how we are. The fact is that we start humanizing AI is whose fault? It's nobody's fault. That's the way we built.
Yeah. Yeah, you're touching on a lot of points there, Kamini. A lot of really big ones, right? That are probably conversations in and of themselves. So there's a few things there, right? One is, something I've learned from all this is we all like to think we're roughly the same in our thinking and our sense of fairness and equity. That's really not true. Like that, we really are this huge spectrum there, and obviously that's being manipulated, I would say, to some degree in terms of creating greater division there through social media and so on. But it is based on, there is a huge spectrum of how people think, and we do kind of have to learn to at least listen to what other people are saying and thinking. Even if we strongly disagree with it, I think it is a big problem. We do need to recognize that people do feel strongly about these things, right? On kind of synthetic information or synthetic video, I absolutely agree with you, right? In the sense of, as far as your brain's concerned, that's not even whether it's a video, a synthetic video, or real video. That's happening in real life, right? How you feel, how your emotions, the chemicals that are released into your body, are treating that as a real thing, right? So, and of course, then this speaks to this idea of, you know, virtual truth. What's truth anymore? Can we trust anything, right? I think it's another, again, a huge problem that we're going, that we're, like, my father got an email from his stockbroker the other day, and he was kind of, oh, is this real or not? I said, look, Dad, from now on, anything, even if it's from me, don't believe it until you've, ring the person, don't care what it is, ring the person and confirm, because, digital trust will mean nothing in a few years, I don't think. So there's a lot of layers there to work through, right? So remind me, what's what's the question again, Kamini?
Oh no, I was
What's the
just,
what's
it wasn't a question actually, it was just a rant on my part.
but again, I absolutely, like, I know from chatting to you before this, we both have very strong senses of justice, and that's why you've got into this space. But there's a great book. It's Michael Sandel. He's a lecturer in Harvard, possibly. He has a book about justice, and he just talks. He gives a number of kind of scenarios and the different ways you can look at these things, like price gouging after a major hurricane in America, because obviously supply and demand changes, and he makes a really strong case for it's okay to price gouge, which is something what I would find absolutely despicable. So, and the point being, what he shows you in that book, or showed me in that book, is you have to be able to look at this from multiple perspectives in a non-judgmental way. I am not right all the time. I'm right very rarely, right? And that ability to at least look at and include that perspective. And this again is multi-stakeholder, right? When we say multi-stakeholder, it's not this kumbaya moment, right? You put these people in a room together, and they've been enemies for the last 40 years, right? You're putting a policeman in with a minority, in with a regulator. They all hate each other, right? So it's about getting these people to sit in the same room and understand each other's perspective, and then build a solution based on that. And so much of everything is understanding, is seeing the other side of the having that kind of understanding why people think the way they think and feel the way they feel, and invariably there's reason for it, and once you understand that, it becomes much easier to find a common solution.
I don't know. I think before the pandemic, I used to be very, very optimistic about our evolution as a species in terms of ethics. We've been on the planet for 300,000 years. In the past 100 years, we've gotten rid of slavery. There's women's rights. There's farm animals' rights. We are killing this. And then the pandemic hit. And then things like, when there's scarcity, what happens? People devolve to something else. And I remember the rage I felt when the UK bought 400,000 vials of vaccines. And I was like, and the rest of us, the rest of the world. And then I realized that it's good to be optimistic, but you have to be rational and realistic as well when it comes to issues like that. And the circumstances will determine the extent to which you are going to behave ethically and what your definition of ethics is, obviously, as well.
Yeah, I look, there are these moments. So I always think of the classic Martin Luther King quote, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? And if you just imagine that as a curve, you're going to have periods where it's really good, and then you're going to have moments where it just drops, and so ultimately it's not a straight line, right? But we are kind of gradually moving in the right direction. And my hope is, understanding is crucial. Even just take it right down to the individual level in the context we're talking about, which is AI use. If there's so many cases and projects I've worked on and experiments I've ran where if the employee or the user doesn't understand the AI model, the system it's part of, and their role within it, there will be problems. There will be a harm or an error that results from that. And I think it's the same. The real hope I have with things like Gen AI and so on is our level of understanding should go up dramatically. Our ability to understand other perspectives, to build our knowledge, to build our wisdom, is so much more kind of available to us now. And with that, I hope comes greater fairness, greater justice. That's historically what kind of the sharing of information and knowledge suggests to me. So that's my hope. Or am I being delusional, Kamini? Am I am I fooling myself?
You know what? I actually don't know at this moment in time, but hopefully us optimists will come out on top at the end of it all. I have to believe that. Um,
What's let me ask you a question. What's the thing that really worries you about AI?
that we will lose connection with each other. The feeling that I am because we are, it will not stand because we are. I see us as a collective embodiment of um, an ecosystem in the universe, and we are slowly losing that. Whether we're going to evolve or devolve or iterate into something else is another question altogether. But there's strength in connection. That's what I think.
Absolutely, and I see where I absolutely see where you're coming from. That fear of we're increasingly virtual,
Mhm.
and but it's interesting too, right? I see the generation coming through in their 20s, and they are actively going out and physically connecting. They are trying to. They're realizing the dangers of their mobile phones, and they're trying increasingly to limit their interaction on those devices. So again, I think we we have to hope that it may sometimes it takes generations for these changes to happen, right? And sometimes it takes major incidents for everybody to kind of wake up and realize, okay, we can't continue down this path. And there are those little troughs that we just talked about on that journey. So I absolutely recognize your fears, and it's a fear I have as well. But I have a belief that we will. Sometimes it takes a major accident to get there, but we will recognize the damage we're doing or the harms we're causing, and pull back.
So I don't have any children, and you mentioned your daughter. So in terms of this AI evolution that we're going through, what gives you hope and what developments or approaches suggest that we might be getting it right?
Oh, the hardest question on the planet right now. Thanks, Kamini. Yeah, it's so hard. It's as I said earlier, I'm trying to look at this from multiple perspectives. I mean, the thing I absolutely see is she has so much information on her fingertips now, and her ability to develop understanding of topics is just increased exponentially compared to when I was going through school. I'm less worried about issues around plagiarism and so on. I think there's a short-term impact there, but I think ultimately the educational system will figure around that and maybe needed an update anyway. And this could be the catalyst for that. Um, I like you. I have this fear of you know living in an increasingly virtualized world, but we work with her, and I see an awful lot of parents doing this, and I think this again is why so quite often it's a generational thing where we tend not to give her access to phones and devices. And I would say that's quite common or becoming increasingly common. And so we're going to see this generation of kids who it isn't their default kind of way of entertaining themselves, hopefully. So, it's very worrying. It's got huge potential. I think I also, like, as I said, the behavioral side of this, right? I think is amazing in terms of therapists and so on. I mean, I think her ability to really understand herself, her emotions, what are her values, what are what's going on in her subconscious, what's sitting in her shadow, all these things. It's going to be so much easier for her and so much cheaper, essentially free for her to really understand these things. So I think that's something that I really like about the potential of AI is, certainly wasn't available to me growing up. That ability to really understand why I'm thinking the way I'm thinking, and how can I live a happier life? How can I live a better life? I think So I think there's huge potential there. So worried but optimistic, if that makes sense. I think there's a job apocalypse as well. I think we have to wait and see on that one, what the impact will be and where the jobs of the future will be. I think there will be impact, but already I see, for example, in responsible AI, right? I think there's going to be as we move to agentic, there's going to be a whole new set of jobs that are specific to responsible AI. This won't be a side of desk for people. It will be their full-time job. There will be a team whose job it is to just manage agents all day. So as an example of new jobs that will emerge. So yeah, that's a very long. The answer is I don't know. I think everything brings pluses and minuses, and I think if you can again build their understanding, make them aware of what this thing can do, what it can't do, calibrate their trust as we talked about, and then trust them to go and do the right things with it.
I mean, young people these days, it's so hard, difficult to understand them. On the one hand, they they have this sense of altruism that doesn't fit into my way of thinking because I'm from a different generation, and they have this empathy which I can't understand as well, because for the first time ever in our history, you can actually feel bad, have empathy, and know what somebody else is going through on the other side of the planet. They probably live in a tent in the middle of the Gobi Desert, but you get this guy. You understand that his mother is upset with him because of whatever. I think it's amazing. And I
Yeah.
think that the fact that, I mean, this is like one of my way out ideas, but I think, pulling the idea of being a hyperscaler and saying AI will be a hyperscaler for the ethical evolution of our people. We are programming AI to be a certain thing, and hopefully with the best of our intentions and ethics, and you are scaling it globally, and suddenly people who, oh, it's actually not a good thing to keep my dog. It's actually not a good thing to leave my dog alone for 6 hours a day, because in Sweden, for example, it's actually illegal. If that just sparks some concern, or sparks, let me think about this. How amazing is that?
Yeah. Okay, we've said the word, I'd say 100 times in this call, and it's for a reason, right? It's understanding. It's building understanding, and perspective. Being able to see another way of life, another way of thinking, and sometimes you'll agree with it, sometimes you won't, but you'll have a better understanding as a result. And I absolutely agree with you. We need to be careful though, right? Because social media was pitched the same way, right? It was going to allow us all to
Yeah.
connect, and that's where intent has a major part to play as well. But yeah, that's my hope. Like that is that as you said, you're already starting to see that ability to connect and understand and maybe disagree. Right? That's okay too. It's okay to disagree, but at least being open to their perspective is really important.
Well, that's another bugbear at the moment, the rise of anti-intellectualism, but that's another topic for another day. Patrick, we need to talk about this. We need to talk the problem with young people these days, but on another podcast session, okay? Patty, where can people follow your work and research?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. That's where I tend to publish most of my kind of papers and articles, and also increasingly my thoughts. I think that's probably the best place to find me. I'm not a very active person on social media for a lot of the reasons we discussed earlier. But yeah, LinkedIn feels to me the kind of the least worst way of getting it out there. So yeah, that'd be the best place to find me.
Patty, thank you so much for your time and expertise and this conversation about the messy reality of building trust in AI, moving beyond principle and to actual practice is exactly what practitioners need to hear right now. And I'm so grateful for your candor and your insights. And we have digressed, but it was so much fun. And hopefully we'll do this soon again.
Absolutely, Kamini. I really enjoyed the conversation. As you said, we went down a lot of different avenues, which is great. But I think, fundamentally, when it comes to responsible AI, I think, you know, we talked a lot about kind of ethics and so on, but really it's a very practical space, and to me it's you could rename it professional AI, right? It's just about doing things well and right. And that invariably brings, in the same way that software engineering evolved with the emergence of agile and DevOps, we're going to see the same thing. Our AI it will become core to agentic AI. You just can't scale it otherwise, and it brings efficiency, it brings revenue, it brings growth, as well as doing the right thing.
Excellent. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavini.